Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And it is 9 p.m. Central African time. A very good evening to you. Warm welcome to the Friday edition of Africa World Hour, where we bring you 60 minutes of the very latest developments from the continent and beyond. I am Tsepiso Makwetla. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Here's a look at your top stories this hour.
1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
And we start with this story. A top lawyer in the Israeli media has accepted her dismissal over the leaking of a video that purportedly shows soldiers raping a Palestinian detainee. In her resignation letter, General Yifat Tomer Yerushalmi admitted responsibility for approving the release of the material. It was broadcast on the Israeli channel 12. The BBC's Sebastian Asher has those details.
The footage shows soldiers at the Stay Taman detention centre taking aside a detainee, then surrounding him with riot shields to block visibility while they allegedly gang raped him. The detainee was subsequently treated for severe injuries. 5 reserve soldiers had been charged over the incident. The video was seen as concrete evidence backing up multiple reports of abuse of Palestinian detainees since the Hamas-led October the 7th attacks.
Moving on to other news, here in South Africa's far northern KwaZulu-Natal province, many locals calling for a better cooperation between South Africa and Mozambique as cross-border crime syndicates become more brazen and ruthless in their attacks. For years, government has tried to curb criminal syndicates from Mozambique who are attacking residents of the Umkhanyawude district. Tami Gabashe, a fake name of a man who fears for his safety, recounts how his family was overpowered by armed robbers in the middle of the night.
When they were inside the house, they destroyed my door in my room forcefully. There were about 4. I think they told us that they are here for the cars. They actually want to take the Fortuna. There was also a single cab, a Hilux, outside the garage. They only told me that they were willing to take a Fortuna. They took us to the back of the Fortuna, to the back seat, me and my wife and my 2 kids. They took also my Hilux. Then they drove to Mozambique using this route from Makonyeni to Mamfene.
The African Union Commissioner for Agriculture, Moses Vilagadi, says the continent must put concerted efforts into tackling the scourge of hunger. Vilagadi says it's concerning that Africa is battling with malnutrition with vast hectares of land. He has been attending the AU's Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Programme Summit in the Rwandan capital of Kigali. The gathering has brought together farmers, experts and policymakers under one roof. Kylie Hlukumalo reports.
The African Union has made a startling revelation. There's almost 300 million people in the continent are facing hunger. The Continental Body's Commissioner for Agriculture, Moses Vilagadi, says Africa is battling with a number of challenges, including high food inflation, climate change that is likely to affect food security, and conflicts in certain regions.
USA strikes on boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific allegedly linked to drug trafficking violates international human rights law. That is according to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk. He's issued a statement warning that the attacks are unacceptable. At least 61 people have been killed, mainly in international waters near Venezuela. Sharon Bryce Peace has that report.
Turk says the attacks by US armed forces against boats in the Pacific and Caribbean are circumstances that find no justification in international law, calling them unacceptable and urging the United States to halt such attacks and take all necessary measures to prevent the extrajudicial killing of people aboard those boats, whatever the criminal conduct alleged against them. The High Commissioner added that under international human rights law, the intentional use of lethal force is only permissible as a last resort against individuals who pose an imminent threat to life. Turk called for prompt, independent and transparent investigations into these attacks. Shervin Brycepeace, SABC News, New York.
And aid agencies say they are disturbed, or rather, aid agencies in Sudan say they're disturbed by the limited number of displaced Darfurians fleeing Al Fashir. The city fell to the paramilitary rapid support forces at the weekend, and widespread reports of mass executions and crimes against humanity are occurring. The BBC's Barsan Etrijan has those details.
The capital of North Darfur has been cut off since its fall, with only about 5,000 people reaching the safety of the nearby town of Tawila. That's worrying aid agencies, given that 250,000 had been in Al Fashir when it fell on Sunday. The RSF and its predecessor, Janjaweed militia, have a long record of crimes against humanity against non-Arab populations. The RSF has denied UN reports of mass killings, but admits it's detained one of its militiamen, Abu Lulu, who has been accused of summary executions.
We are on Open Views Audio Bouquet. Channel 628. Get Channel Africa on DSTV Audio Bouquet. Channel 802. Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on African World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
Cast our eye now to Tanzania, where, according to opposition leaders, as many as 700 people have reportedly been killed after taking to the streets to protest this week's presidential election, which saw the increasingly authoritarian incumbent President Samia Suluhu Hassan run unopposed for another term after her main challengers were jailed or barred from standing. Some reports allege that President Samia Suluhu Hassan has even fled the State House. And this is amid the protests. Our reporter Nhlanhla Mahlangu was in Tanzania for several days, but due to the communication blackout, was unable to reach us to give us updates on what exactly is happening. But she is now back in the country, in South Africa, and she joins us to share her experiences in Tanzania. And Nhlanhla, a very good evening to you. So let's just first start with day one, your arrival in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam. What exactly did you experience?
Good evening, Tsepiso, and good evening to our listeners. We arrived in Tanzania on Monday morning, and as expected, we were supposed to go collect our accreditation cards, which would have allowed us to cover the elections, because that was the main reason why we were there. And we went to INEC only to be told that our names are not appearing on the accredited media that is supposed to cover these elections, which came as a shock to us, because when we left South Africa en route to Tanzania, we were assured that our accreditation had been approved. By checking on the system, what we did, we applied online and submitted all the required documents. So to our surprise, we were told that we did not follow the correct procedure in uploading those documents. There was some missing information that we omitted in our application, because it was the two of us who were representing Channel Africa. We had another colleague from the Chinyanja service, Tamo Kapisa, together with myself, who had traveled to Tanzania. So our day really started on that sad note that we could not get the accreditation that would have allowed us to move freely and go to polling stations and actually cover these elections.
Just a minute, let me understand this, because typically some of that information is communicated to customs when you arrive. So did you have any problems with customs when you entered the country? Because often, particularly if you're a journalist and it's during elections, and in some countries where there are contested elections, it really starts at customs officials whether they recognize the reason for being there and give you entry. So did you experience such problems or not?
Not at all. Not at all. When we arrived there, we were allowed to enter the country and proceed to the hotel, we did not get any resistance. We did not come across any problems. Hence, we assumed that our accreditation had been approved.
And it is indeed quite strange, because if you didn't encounter problems at customs, the fact that you would not have been on the database of INEC is something that would raise an eyebrow. But were there other colleagues from other countries or other news services or publications that experienced the same challenges?
When we got to INEC, there were two other reporters from a radio station based in Kenya who also encountered a similar problem. And the lady that assisted us kept on asking who we were dealing with, and it was difficult for us to really tell her who we were dealing with, because when you apply on the system. There isn't an individual that is allocated to assist journalists or even send emails to communicate. So there was no form of communication, but we were the two journalists coming from Channel Africa and the two gentlemen from a radio station that is based in Kenya. Other than that, we did not see any other foreign media around where we were based, because we were based in Dar es Salaam. So, yeah, as things stand, I'm not aware if there's any other media that was barred or that encountered similar problems other than me and Tamo and the two gentlemen that were from a Kenyan radio station.
So then there were reports of an internet shutdown, which disrupted phone lines and other means of online communication, which, as we've heard before, is not surprising. And just personally, I have heard for a friend or two in Tanzania, when seeking certain interviews or people that they could connect me with, he let it be known that there is resistance from government of certain individuals speaking to particularly the media. Did you get a sense that that was what was happening, that it was a constricting of the space to allow for freer reporting on what's happening there?
I must say this was frustrating, because there was a complete shutdown across the country, not just the media. Even people who were at the hotel that we were at experienced the same fate. As we were moving around, people were experiencing the same fate. We tried also communicating with local journalists that we know that are based in Tanzania. We could not communicate. So the blackout was across the country. It wasn't just restricted to media personnel. It was restricted to everybody who was in Tanzania, because I suspect they feared that they did not want the videos that were doing rounds to be shared amongst people. It's just a suspicion that I have, because there was no warning whatsoever about this blackout. Initially, when we got there, the communication lines were open. I was able to communicate with people in South Africa and alert them on what the plans were for the day. Only at midday, when we were supposed to give an update on what is happening on election day, that's when we realized that the lines are no longer going out and coming in. So the blackout affected almost everybody in the country, Tsepiso.
And I've gone further to ask the question that, given the fact that it did affect everyone, but I think the point I was making is that I know there is word that the media are discouraged, and particularly if it's negative reporting in some places. But was there a sense of a highly policed environment during the elections?
Yes, there was, starting by the fact that we were not get that accreditation that we thought we had that would have allowed us to cover these elections. So there was a deliberate attempt to prevent the media from reporting, because even when we were based at the hotel, just looking at the various local television stations there, there was just minimal coverage about these elections. There was nothing on the internet, obviously, because that was completely down. But even the local channels that are there, I think the only channel that was able to carry live updates was a TV station that is based in Kenya, and they were doing so remotely because their reporters are based in Nairobi, but they were getting information somehow, through people that are there. I don't know how they were able to do it because everything was just down. So there was a deliberate attempt to minimize us putting out information about these elections, I must say, Tsepiso.
And just finally, so what we have seen as the growing protests, which have, ended up very dangerous in the sense that people have been killed, and the protests which are growing in numbers across the country. Was there an indication of that agitation wherever you went, of this grouping of Gen Z and about the elections specifically?
After we were denied the accreditation that would have allowed us to cover these elections, what we did then, we decided to go back to the hotel. But when we were there, we decided to just take a stroll and just to gather the views of the locals around Dar es Salaam. And majority of the people that we were asking about these elections, firstly, seem not to care about the elections, saying it's a one-woman show and nothing is going to change. But there were talks, there were rumors that there were protests that are being planned. And that quickly spread very quickly because as we were sitting at the hotel, we were then suddenly told by hotel management to stay put and not leave the hotel because it's just suddenly become dangerous, and the protesters are moving towards the direction of the hotel. So that on its own just caused a bit of panic and fear amongst people who were around the vicinity where we were because of that, saying that, the protesters are heading towards that hotel, but the military and the police are also up and about on the streets and preventing people from going ahead with this protest. So the young people in Kenya, in Tanzania, pardon me, that we spoke to, clearly said that they will not be partaking in these elections. And I must just add, Tsepiso, as much as we did not get the accreditation to cover these elections, there were 2 polling stations that were just close by. It was just a stone throw away from the hotel that we were. And we decided to just take a walk just to get a sense of what, and how this election is proceeding. And believe you me when I tell you that at one particular polling station, there were literally 2 people, and the majority of the people that were there were the support staff from INEC and observer missions. And further down, obviously, because the roads also had police and military at almost every corner, you could just sense that, it was a ghost town around Dar es Salaam. So people either decided not to go out to vote, or people were still regrouping because knowing that later on, they will be part of the protest that we saw that broke up eventually and which still continue up until today, reportedly, at Tsepiso.
All right, Nhlanhla, thank you so much for that. That is our colleague who went to Tanzania to cover the elections, but they were obviously not allowed to get accreditation to cover the elections. Nhlanhla Mahlangu speaking to us about her experiences and the challenges that she encountered. So let's move on now. Still on Tanzania, looking at the developments, doing some deep dive analysis into what could be happening, what is happening. We speak now to Professor Kyaleboga Mapunye, who speaks to us about this as a democracy and elections expert. A very good evening to Prof. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, Tsepiso, and good evening to your viewers. Thank you for inviting me.
Professor Mapunya, somebody whom we've worked together over the years, covering elections in South Africa specifically. I'm just thinking back, listening to Ntlantla's experience, and it reminds me of my own personal on-the-ground experiences covering, I'm thinking of elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm thinking of the environment in Zimbabwe on many a times, and on a different end, covering, observing elections in Egypt. Very militaristic, very securocratic, heavy presence. Is this just another page from the same hymn book that we're seeing play out in Tanzania?
Tsepiso, I'm afraid your observations, experiences are almost very similar to mine. I've seen the same script in countries like Uganda, 2016, countries like Zimbabwe, 2013, and even the recent ones. And of course, it's the same script in several African countries. It's very worrisome. I've just heard your guest Ntlantla talking about, mentioning words like fear and panic. For me, Tsepiso, whenever an election is punctuated by words like those, disappearances, harassment of the media, of civil society, detention and arrests and repressive measures, it worries me a lot that we are not going to have a free and fair election. We are not going to have a credible election. And unfortunately, it looks like even though we are still carefully observing the outcome of the Tanzanian elections, the script might just be veering exactly in that direction.
And we're hearing some worrying figures, alarming figures from opposition who are saying as many as 700 people could have been killed in the clashes with security forces. On the one hand, critics of the opposition will be saying that it's an exaggeration, but the very opposition parties and some human rights bodies have been saying there have been kidnappings, there have been arrests, there have been killings that have not been widely reported because the state has been putting on a front of an environment that is conducive to free and fair elections. Just how sinister is the environment in Tanzania now? Or do we have to take the reports from the opposition in measured doses?
We have to take all reports from both the opposition as well as from the official circles carefully, because it is almost like a case of he said, she said, allegations, counter allegations. Normally in an election, a disputed election or an election that has signs of dispute and conflict, including electoral violence, it's often very, very difficult even to take sides with one side, especially the opposition, official opposition or otherwise, or even the governing party, or even the government. Because during an election, Tsepiso, even the government, remember, it is a contender in an election. It is part and parcel of the competition. It is a participant. So normally, for instance, in my circles, whenever we are observing elections, we have to know that you need to first assess the veracity of allegations and counter allegations. And in such an environment whereby there's a blanket media ban, or maybe there's a closure of the internet, such as what has happened in Tanzania. In 2016, when I was in Uganda, a similar thing happened whereby the internet is just switched off. And so counter accusations and accusations are very, very often very difficult to verify. So in such instances, therein lies the limitation of assessing whether Tanzania's electoral outcome is democratic, is legitimate, because now you have got some kind of a suppression, apparent suppression of the outcome and what is truly happening. Journalists are struggling to get accreditation, such as what your guest was saying earlier, and I'm just wondering how many were denied such accreditation. It usually happens in those countries that we call electoral authoritarian states. In other words, these are countries which hold elections, but with a semblance, a very, very minimal semblance of democratic participation and compliance to the regulations of free and fair elections, such as, for instance, as outlined in the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and other international election, management statutes and instruments and standards. So it makes it very, very difficult. But we have to keep looking at those reports. I would think that 700 could be far off the mark. But like I'm saying, if you are not able to verify from independently from the official sources, you are quite likely to go with that, more than 700 deaths, that have occurred coming from the opposition. My sources were telling me that at least 2 deaths were verified, one from a police officer and another one a civilian. But again, it's neither here nor there, because some reports are actually disputing this very small number.
I mean, just looking back at the environment in the lead up to the elections, there already were criticisms pointed at President Suluhu Hassan as a leader of the CCM, which has been in governance for decades, as actually rolling back on the reforms that she had promised when she came in after President Magufuli, and some even accusing her as even far worse. But I want to look at it in as objective manner as possible, the democratic architecture of Tanzania. There was a legislative change, a constitutional change to the INEC Act of 2024. So some have said that while it introduced reforms, it had some serious legislative gaps.
President Suluhu Hassan has come in, obviously, after the death of former president, the late John Magufuli, promising, obviously, what you have just said, reforms, and some would even say a reversal of what they used to be termed Magufuli's more authoritarian tendencies towards, the opposition and civil rights. As was, he was criticized then by bodies, several, human rights bodies such as Human Rights Watch and the others. He introduced, most importantly, things like reconciliation, even reform, shortly after coming to power, after 2021. But then subsequently, critics, note that, heavy-handed, approach to the opposition, especially, the political, major opposition parties such as Chadema, for instance, whose leader was arrested, just in the run-up to this election. Obviously, this sort of seems to taint her, record to date. But of course, we have to remember that Tanzania has been one of, the beacons of peaceful elections, even surpassing the records of other, neighbors in the SADC region, where we had seen, violence. Tanzania never used to have that. But of course, we are talking about the earlier years from 1995 onwards, and up until Magufuli took over. And then, of course, the opposition parties and civil society organizations were accusing his regime of repressive tendencies and authoritarian practices. But now with Suluhu Hassan, it becomes very, very difficult to assess her record based on the few years that she has been in power, because remember, she took over the term of office of her predecessor. So it's going to be, in my view, a mixed assessment of her legacy or her role to date. Of course, if as the polls outcome suggests that she has won, then of course we will continue assessing her regime based on the criticisms of her policies, and of course the good things that some Tanzanians have said she is doing, especially in terms of infrastructure and development. So it's more like a divided political score, if you like.
Okay. So, Prof, I mean, the Gen Z are asking at the moment that there be a cessation of the preliminary release of election results. And when I look at some of those gaps that are being pointed to, it does raise concern, because it's been noted that some of the legal frameworks that exist, like the Cybercrimes Act of 2015, the Personal Data Protection of 2022, that they have significant gaps regarding election data integrity. And we know questions around the independent transparency of INEC has also been raised. So the data that has been released now isn't being released within an environment of credible democratic systems.
It is very, very difficult to ascertain that, given the tension, the political tension, and one could even say the political instability that we are seeing, judging by the media reports that we are receiving from Tanzania. One would have expected a different scenario whereby you release this kind of information based on transparency, based on accountability to all the political parties, irrespective of whether this is a governing or ruling party or an opposition party, but making sure that in line with the requirements and provisions of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, you've got to make sure that you avoid creating an environment that is not conducive to free and fair elections. And that environment, which is not conducive to free and fair elections, is this one of barring certain individuals, sometimes even apparently on spurious grounds or basis, and also making sure that you reduce the space for participation, and you instill fear, especially in certain sections of the populace or the voters. In such a situation, it becomes very, very difficult at the end of the day to say in the pre-elections period the situation was free and fair and conducive for a free and fair poll. At the same time, as was seen with the protests on election day, one becomes finds it very difficult to give a clean bill to Tanzania's elections on E-Day, on election day, because you've got all these situations that are happening outside that, in my view, normally affects the credibility of the poll. In other words, to what extent can we say that people were freely and fairly and without any harassment, without any so-called no-go areas, such as what we have seen in some parts of South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal in the previous elections in 2024, whereby people are generally barred from participating. So if there are no-go areas, then we can safely say that the poll is credible, the participation is credible, is open, is free and fair. But if there are all these instances of repression and people being barred, and of course, vehicles and buses and transportation means being, torched, burnt by the protesters, and the security forces using live rounds of ammunition. At the end of the day, Tsepiso, it becomes very difficult to give such an election a clean bill of health.
Prof, thank you so much for speaking to us. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but we do appreciate your insights and your input on what is happening in Tanzania. Of course, we will await further developments and see if we can get more information out of what is happening in the East African countries as post-election violence continues. It is just about 25 minutes past 9. We're speaking there to Professor Kealeboga Mapunye, who is a democracy and elections expert.
Siyabangena manje. Vito Jablan Kolele Imakota. Jablan is a young man from Giyani in Limpopo in South Africa. Very easy guy, taking things easy. To know me is to know that I love what I do, which I'm crazy about it. So when you hear me on radio, expect the best. Expect great music. Expect great content. Expect 180 minutes of nothing but fun. You'll find me on the morning reset, 3 to 6 a.m., Monday to Friday. Siyabangena baba. Ay. Mbuleke.
1 hour, 1 continent, 1 voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
And it is now 26 minutes to 10. Leaders, investors, and development partners from across the continent have gathered in Luanda, Angola, for the third summit on financing for Africa's infrastructure development. The theme this year is Capital Corridors Trade, investing in infrastructure for the AfCFTA and shared prosperity. The summit is aimed at catalyzing infrastructure investment across Africa in alignment with the continent-wide scheme program for infrastructure development in Africa. We're joined now by Her Excellency Lerato Mataboge, Commissioner for Infrastructure and Energy at the African Union. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Tsepiso. Good evening to you and your viewers.
So let's just first start by framing the Luanda summit. It's focused on building a sovereign Africa. From what is on the table, what has been speaking about, what is the base point from which we're moving, and especially I'm thinking with the timelines of 2030, 2050, and how far are we towards achieving a sovereign Africa for all?
Thank you for that very, very pivotal question. Agenda 2063 and our Pan-African vision says that as sovereign Africa, or the vision that we have of ourselves as Africa, is an integrated Africa that is prosperous, that is powered by the innovation and the strength of its citizens. So that is the vision we've set for ourselves, to say by 2063 we want to see ourselves as prosperous. And what does prosperous mean? In those terms, it means that every African country should have reached minimum middle income status. 2, our country should be integrated by infrastructure, corridor infrastructure, aviation infrastructure, inclusive of maritime as well. And we are looking at a continent that is trading with itself, that is investing in itself, basically an Africa that is consuming what Africa produces and producing what Africa consumes. That is how we define sovereignty for ourselves, the Pan-African 2063 vision.
And what I find interesting, I mean, you will go to many African countries and you will notice development, but that often happens within the urban areas. And I understand that migration is a major push for that, but just in the framework that is designed, whether from a national perspective or a regional perspective, why does it seem that the rural areas seem to be left out in this planning? Or is it just a subjective view that I'm expressing here?
You're certainly not expressing a subjective view. There are challenges at national level in terms of geographic spread, and we find the same challenges also permeating themselves continentally in terms of also how we connect, for example, landlocked countries to those that are closest to the ports. So the overall conversations and the importance of having the conversation that reverse what we call the pit-to-port model of infrastructure planning are quite pivotal. As we have those conversations at continental level and regional level, we're also saying that we need to connect peri-urban areas and rural areas to urban nodes, and also move industrial nodes to the rural areas, because the challenge of urbanization is that everybody's moving to where there's economic opportunity, and national infrastructure planning has to take that into account and make sure that we move economic activity to other parts, one, of countries and other parts of the continent. So our problem is not just national, it's also around, how we also incorporate landlocked countries. And for Africa, we've got the additional challenge that we do have island states as well that are not necessarily fully integrated into the continent. So your observation is quite spot on.
So I'm also just thinking, with a financing gap of $100 billion annually, there is a lot of talk now, especially in the midst of, financial aid cuts, that there must be domestic resource mobilization, and there are all kinds of innovative plans that are being used. But it's also about the vision. Is it being directed in, because you can't improve some of these things obviously without the infrastructure, yet at the same time I'm looking at the needs of the African citizenry in terms of health, education, water and electricity. Those are day-to-day human rights that are being denied people. So how are we going to balance this and make sure that the ring fencing is effective?
The fundamental premise that we have is that we can't have the Africa that we want, a prosperous, integrated Africa, without the infrastructure that we need. At the core of it, that infrastructure is industrial infrastructure, energy, for example. We need to power our industries, we need to power our schools, we need to power our homes, we need to power our hospitals. So the African infrastructure deficit and energy poverty is a critical challenge that we are working very hard to overcome. Similarly, over and above infrastructure, the world is digitalizing. As we deal with the backlog of fundamental basic infrastructure, we also have to make sure that the African continent is not left behind in terms of the digital agenda, and making sure that we have digital infrastructure as well. Similarly, the connectivity that we spoke of earlier around connecting ourselves through cross-border infrastructure becomes quite critical. So the conversation is not necessarily mutually exclusive in terms of other social infrastructure needs that the continent has. But the priority then is, how do we fund this infrastructure? And before funding this infrastructure, how do we prepare it? Because the biggest gap that has been raised throughout in various conversations, whether it's the funders or the EPC contractors or even global partners in the form of sovereigns that want to contribute to infrastructure development, is the question of bankability of the projects that we have on the continent. So the critical conversation is around preparing our own projects that we showcase to the rest of the partners, both on the continent and abroad. And one critical aspect as well is the issue of African domestic resource mobilization. We have found now, through a study that was launched in June this year, 2025, that $4.6 trillion of African financing is not deployed into the real economy, sitting in pension funds, for example, sovereign wealth funds of various countries, and various other insurance assets. And the challenge and the priority now is to enable the environment that can have that resource deployed. If we have $100 billion annual deficit and there's $4.6 trillion that is not deployed, it means that we can actually meet the infrastructure gap and close it. But we need to work together with the private sector to make sure that we have the enabling environment for the funds to be deployed.
I was recently at the African Energy Week, and one of the things that were spoken about was project preparation, especially if we're talking about bankability. But what is bankability? What does that look like in terms of pipeline? But for me, and the conversation was also around infrastructure, particularly if we're looking at building pipelines that interconnect Africa as a whole. But there is also the challenge of moving beyond domestic consumption, especially when we talk about the AfCFTA and the line up to securing the deal. There were conversations that were very difficult to nail down when it comes to regulation, for instance, and agreement on what is our common goal. Are those discussions being had here at the summit you're at, and what are seen as the bottlenecks?
Certainly. And what has been helpful is sharpening our value proposition as a collective, as Africa, and articulating a joint vision, because now we are saying we want to mobilize for infrastructure that enables the African continental free trade area. We need infrastructure that is able to move cargo, to move goods among African countries, similarly to move people, because there is a need for movement of persons, similarly to the movement of goods. So by prioritizing in that manner, it then enables us to, cluster our strategic infrastructure to say we cannot trade without energy, for example. How do we power factories? So we need to prioritize energy in its different forms, renewables, inclusive of traditional modes of energy generation. We need to start talking about digital infrastructure in practical terms, because digital trade is another frontier of trade. So what type of digital infrastructure do we need, as an example? Transport infrastructure that we require to trade. Rail is priority. How do we then begin to talk more about an integrated rail network on the continent and the different regulatory alignments that are required? Aviation is another one that moves people, that moves cargo. So our single air transport market that we are advancing is around that. So certainly infrastructure that enables Africa to trade among its African countries, to trade among themselves, and African people to move within the continent is quite pivotal. And that is the priority that we're advancing throughout all the different conversations with partners and at the conference.
And speaking of partners, given the shifting global financial landscape, there's a lot more talk about the role of development banks, because they are able to offer more favorable terms. But if we go outside, because they obviously can't carry a big part, or the whole load, we will still have to have international partners, of which the question of debt traps always comes back to the center of the conversation. So you're saying that as a collective we have to give a more a convincing argument in terms of our value add. So how do we renegotiate those conversations, and which partners do we look to, given also, as I said, the tenuous environment that we're seeing geopolitically?
The interesting fact when it comes to infrastructure, and this is again one of the key outcomes of the conversation, to say, the rest of the world has an infrastructure plan for Africa. And we need to, all 55 member states, be able to articulate in one voice our infrastructure plan for ourselves as a continent. For example, we've got China that's got the Belt and Road Initiative. That's the Chinese plan for infrastructure. The Japanese, through the different work that is done through JICA and the border post work that is being done. We've got even the US has the PGII program, which is an infrastructure program for Africa. EU has a EU gateway, etc. So the point being, there's not a lack of plans and strategic engagement by various partners with the continent for, of course, their own national interests. So the question is then, how do we begin to articulate our own interest in one voice and sharpen the collective work that we have done through the single African air transport market advancement, single electricity market, for example, connecting our power pools, etc. There's a myriad of interventions that we have as a continent. What has been missing is 1, domesticating them, 2, speaking to them with one voice, 3, ensuring that we anchor them primarily on African resource mobilization and crowd in partners to supplement what are African resources instead of the other way around, or instead of waiting for every other partner to articulate their infrastructure vision for us and us not articulating one for ourselves.
And Your Excellency, I'm sure this is something that you will relate to, and I'm pretty sure you'll agree with me on that. Our value proposition also has to have at its center women, children, and adolescents, because women, the infrastructure generally in Africa is against women, as in it is more cumbersome on women and children and adolescents. There must be some quiescence on their vision of what that value proposition for Africa is that we are offering to partners.
No, absolutely spot on. And that is an area of work that we are looking to strengthen as the African Union, being mindful that, we haven't really had a concerted focus area in that regard. And the argument is that in as much as we are beginning to talk and have clear programs around climate resilient infrastructure, we need to talk about infrastructure that is, enabling to women, to children of the continent. So absolutely, that is a very, very important area of work. And when we talk about a prosperous Africa that is powered by her own citizens, our KPI has to be how have we empowered men, women, and children of the African continent? Infrastructure front, rightly stated. We have to make sure that we work with our member states, and when the infrastructure planning is done, it takes into account the needs of the citizenry as a whole, and not just certain segments and not just certain industries versus the people.
And I'm only raising that because sometimes we do find that we have to be intentional, for instance, in applying a gendered lens to some of these future projects, because we can't talk about inclusivity, we can't talk about job creation if we are not zeroing in, looking at it from that prism.
Absolutely. We have to. For example, if we, just as we discussed earlier around the AfCFTA, majority of informal traders or small-scale traders on the continent are women, crossing borders on a daily basis. There's safety issues around inefficient infrastructure across the board. So we're quite alive to the gendered impact of infrastructure planning and provision, and where there's none and where there is. So certainly, that is quite an important element in our strategy and our policy formulation.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us and giving us your time to share the insights from that conversation that you had. And we're talking here about the theme of this year, Capital Corridors, Trade, Investing in Infrastructure for the AfCFTA. And that is at the third Summit on Financing for Africa's Infrastructure Development, and that was Her Excellency Lerato Mataboge, Commissioner for Infrastructure and Energy at the African Union, gleaning those insights for us. And that summit happening in Luanda in Angola. Brings the time to 7 minutes to 10.
Este é o Caleidoscópio de Canal África, com Remo Samo e João Yabalá.
O surto da cólera em Angola tem causado grande preocupação, afetando já mais de metade das províncias do país. Simultaneamente, a Agência dos Estados Unidos para o Desenvolvimento Internacional, USAID, um dos maiores doadores mundiais de assistência humanitária, decidiu não priorizar os países com maior incidência de malária. Para discutirmos as causas do alastramento da cólera em Angola e os impactos dessa decisão da USAID, Presidente. Convidamos o Dr. Jeremias Agostinho, médico e mestre em saúde pública, para partilhar a sua visão sobre o tema.
A doença, nesse momento, representa o maior risco de saúde pública que nós temos. Nos últimos anos, a nossa preocupação esteve sempre centrado com os casos de malária, os casos de tuberculose e também de infecção por VIH-Sida. A forma como, em pouco menos de 2 meses, os casos de cólera vêm aumentando, acaba por representar, nessa altura, um dos maiores desafios que o país tem. É expectável que, nesta fase, o número de casos venha a aumentar.
De segunda a sexta-feira, das 20 às 21 horas locais, este é o Caleidoscópio do Canal África.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
So as we wrap up the program, we wrap it up in what's happening in the United States. We're in conversation with James Henry, Global Justice Fellow at Yale University, about what has been seen as a major shift in U.S. refugee policy. President Donald Trump setting the refugee admissions calling for fiscal year 2026 at just 7,500 people. And a very good evening to you, James, and thank you so much for speaking to us. What is your interpretation of this new shift in policy, refugee policy, and what exactly is it articulating? How do you understand it?
Well, ever since February, shortly after Trump took office, he was talking about issuing privileged access to the U.S. for white Afrikaners who he claimed were victims of genocide in South Africa. And he issued an executive order back then. This is kind of a continuation of that. Just early September, he designated a group called the Amerikaners, headed by someone called Samantha Busa, who appears on her LinkedIn. She was from Durban. I guess it's not really clear what she was doing in Durban, but she's an English-speaking South African who's been charged by the State Department with managing referrals for white Afrikaners and other white people from South Africa. This latest policy with respect to visas, the United States has always been a refuge for people seeking asylum. We had a quota of about 125,000 per year for that, and he's just cut that to 7,500. But within that, he's giving privileges to English speakers and also to white Afrikaners, who he claims are victims of this supposed genocide. The idea that this is actually going to help white farmers or South Africa achieve any kind of constitutional democracy, sort of is just ridiculous. But Trump is basically at heart has always been not even a closet racist. And this makes it pretty clear. I don't think this will survive even this Supreme Court to have explicit
That's what I wanted
discrimination.
To ask, because a lot of his executive orders, if my figures are correct, I think you have around 70% of them that have been subjected to a Supreme Court scrutiny. Is it likely to survive even with his motivation of, humanitarian discrimination against white Afrikaners, but it's being labeled as selective humanitarianism?
Well, I think it's highly selective. It puts a very clear legal challenge to the Trump Supreme Court. This is one of the most blatant acts of discrimination you could imagine, to build this actually into the law. The evidence for genocide against whites in South Africa is very limited. They're doing pretty well. They own about 75% of arable land, and there has been 50 to 75 murders per year of white farmers, but that is considerably down from the rate in the 90s. When I visited Orange Free State back in 2016, I think the figure was running in the 90s. It's any amount of it is, of course, despicable, but most of it's due to robberies. It doesn't seem to have much to do with targeting, and there are a lot of colored and black victims as well of these attacks. So the case for there being a genocide, there's genocide in Gaza. We can point that out. There's genocide, that we've seen historically in South Africa itself. But this will not withstand even this Supreme Court scrutiny.
But it just also, finally, as a question, just trying to be prescient about what's likely to happen within the Trump presidency in terms of his own understanding of international humanitarian law, particularly with regards to refugee status. Will it hold up master, though?
I think it will slow things down, but I don't think it will withstand legal scrutiny. And I think most white South Africans who've looked at this have agreed. They've only had about 100 who have responded out of the 4.3 million whites in South Africa, roughly as of last year, who have responded as of August of this year to this solicitation. So, the U.S. economy is not a great place to come right now. Growth is slowed. The tariff policy is not really working. And I think if Trump really wanted to do something to help whites in South Africa or any population in South Africa, he would actually take off the tariffs that he imposed on South Africa. The agriculture sector accounts for about 10% of GDP. South Africa's exports are about 1% of GDP, 1.5% of GDP, and 10% of your exports. So,
James, I want to end it there, but I think it's something we definitely have to lock in on, just in terms of AGOA and this humanitarian refugee status that Donald Trump is giving Afrikaners. That could he help them rather from back here at home if he wants to be selective. But I really do appreciate you all taking the time, albeit it's short today. But thank you very much, James Henry, Global Justice Fellow from Yale University, just speaking to us about President Donald Trump's invitation to white Afrikaners to kom bly by ons. Am I correct, Nambuso? She's coming to talk to us about what's coming up on African Diaries.
Kom bly by ons, yeah.
Kom bly by ons.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm just thinking.
No, I mean, Afrikaans. I actually did study Afrikaans.
And?
Interesting language.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'm in for Shayla today. We've swapped roles. She's not feeling quite well, but that's a pity.
I hope it's not the tummy thing, because
it's the tummy thing with everyone.
I'm still suffering today.
Yeah.
I can't believe I took a whole pack of, you get them in 6 Imodiums.
Yeah.
I've never 6 Imodiums.
Apparently vinegar works.
No, vinegar makes my tummy even worse.
No, it helps me.
Worcester sauce, I know my mother swears by that.
Yeah.
But this is the worst I've had, just in terms of... I think that our viewers...
They're more interested in what's coming on African Diaries tonight. Well, as I'm standing in for Shayla, we'll be speaking on our first hour. We have Paul du Toit, who's a speaker and author of a very interesting book. Quite excited about this. It's the book of persuasion. So it's how you can influence and change people's minds through their decision while building their trust. So it's basically how to influence someone while building trust.
I know you.
You know me.
I can see where this is going.
So you know me all too well. You know me all too well.
I'm going to be listening to the questions.
So looking forward to this. And at least Paul du Toit is coming in studio. And in our second hour, we obviously have, our top 6 love songs from Kondwana, Nyama, Sauka. And looking forward to the first hour, obviously. And then the second hour, then it's going to ease us into saying, those love songs, who do you play them to after persuading them?
I was going to say they turn to persuasion. Let's say I know you.
You know me.
All right, thank you. That's an interesting note to end Africa World Hour on, because we're easing you into the week here to get what you want from us. Goodbye, folks.
Nighttime radio, just the way you like it.